What would you do if your husband of 20 years stood up at your anniversary party, raised a glass, and announced he was leaving you? Not in private. Not after the guests went home. But right there. In front of your children. Your friends. His colleagues. Now imagine his assistant is sitting at your table when he does it. And when you smile, hand him an envelope, and calmly say, "Congratulations." He's the one who starts screaming. That's exactly what happened to me. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 42 years old. And on the night that was supposed to celebrate 20 years of marriage to Richard Carter, 45, I watched my husband try to rewrite our entire history with one rehearsed toast. The private dining room at Bellamy's was glowing gold that night. Soft candlelight. Crystal glasses. A banner that read 20 years strong hung behind us. 60 guests filled the room, family, close friends, 2 of Richard's board members, even a few neighbors who had watched our kids grow up. Mia, 17, wore a navy dress and kept adjusting her bracelet nervously. Daniel, 14, had on a blazer he hated but wore because I asked him to. They were proud. They thought this night meant something. And so did I. At least, I had once. Because here's the part most people don't understand. When Richard stood up and tapped his glass, I already knew. The clinking sound cut through the chatter. He smiled, that polished executive smile. The one that had helped him climb from entry-level analyst to regional operations director at a logistics firm pulling in 7 figures a year. He looked confident. Too confident. "I just want to say," he began, voice smooth, "that after 20 years, I've decided it's time to start over." Silence. You could feel the oxygen leave the room. At first, people thought he was joking. A renewal of vows. A big romantic twist. Someone even laughed lightly. Then he added, "Life is too short to stay where you're not truly happy." And that's when everyone followed his gaze. To Sophie Lane, 28 years old. His executive assistant. Sitting 3 seats down from him. Wearing a tight white dress and a smile that froze the second all eyes turned toward her. Did you catch that? He didn't even have the courage to say her name. He just looked. My daughter stopped breathing. My son's jaw tightened. My sister gasped so loudly it echoed. And me? I smiled. That's the part people replay in their heads. Why didn't she cry? Why didn't she throw a drink? Why didn't she slap him? Because by that point, I wasn't shocked. I was prepared. For months, something had been shifting. Late meetings that never matched calendar invites. New passwords on shared accounts. A sudden obsession with privacy. Credit card charges from boutique hotels in the city. The kind you don't use for business conferences. Did he think I wouldn't notice? Here's a statistic that might surprise you. Most financial infidelity cases aren't discovered through dramatic confessions. They're uncovered through small inconsistencies, repeated patterns, quiet math. I'm very good at math. So while Richard was planning his grand exit, I was doing something else entirely. I was gathering evidence. But no one in that room knew that. They only saw a wife who had just been humiliated in front of everyone she loved. Richard lifted his glass again, clearly expecting applause. Or at least stunned silence that made him look brave. Instead, I stood. I smoothed my dress. And I said, clear and steady, "Congratulations." The word echoed in the quiet room like a dropped plate. You could see confusion ripple across his face. This wasn't in the script he'd rehearsed in his head. I walked toward him slowly. Every step deliberate. The heels I chose that night weren't accidental. Neither was the envelope in my hand, thick, cream-colored, sealed. I handed it to him. "Open it," I said softly. Up close, I could see the faint tremor in his fingers. He hadn't expected engagement. He had expected collapse. He slid a finger under the flap. Pulled out the first document. His expression shifted almost immediately. Confusion first. Then disbelief. Then something darker. He flipped to the second page. The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. "What is this?" he whispered. "Keep reading," I said. He turned another page. And that's when the color drained from his face. The confident executive disappeared. The man who had just declared he was starting over in front of 60 witnesses suddenly looked like someone who had stepped into a trap he didn't know existed. And then, he started screaming. Not shouting in anger, screaming in panic. But what was inside that envelope wasn't just proof of an affair. It was something much worse. And the truth is, he had been the one building this moment for months. He just didn't realize I was building it too. But to understand why he really screamed, we have to go back. Back to the first small lie. Back to the first transfer of money. Back to the moment I realized my husband wasn't just cheating on me. He was planning to erase me. And that's when everything changed. Affairs don't start in hotel rooms. They start in patterns. Small ones. The kind you can almost explain away if you want to. Looking back, the first red flag wasn't lipstick on a collar or a mysterious phone call in the middle of the night. It was silence. The slow, creeping kind. The kind that settles into a marriage so quietly you don't notice it replacing conversation. Richard used to tell me everything. Office politics. Budget frustrations. Who was getting promoted? Who wasn't pulling their weight? Then suddenly, I was getting summaries instead of stories. Long day. Just work stuff. You wouldn't be interested. Wouldn't be interested? After 20 years of building that life together, that was the first crack. Then came the phone. Face down on the table. Always on silent. Password changed. We had shared passwords for years, not out of surveillance, but convenience. Grocery apps. Streaming accounts. Calendar syncing. One afternoon, I picked up his phone to check a dinner reservation confirmation. The screen lit up. Password required. I remember staring at it longer than necessary. Not because I thought he's cheating, but because I thought, why now? And here's the thing most people won't admit. Intuition is rarely dramatic. It's quiet, annoying, persistent. I didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, I watched. The late meetings increased. Tuesdays. Then Thursdays. Then entire Saturdays blocked off for strategic planning sessions. He started going to the gym at 9 p.m. Who changes their entire workout routine at 45? Then Sophie's name began appearing everywhere. Sophie handled the presentation. Sophie stayed late to help. Sophie thinks we should restructure logistics. Sophie. I met her once at a holiday party. 28, polished, intelligent. The kind of woman who knows exactly how long to hold eye contact. She laughed at everything Richard said, even things that weren't funny. At the time, I dismissed it as ambition. Young professionals attach themselves to power. It's common. But then something happened that wasn't common. A credit card statement. I handle our household finances. Always have. It made sense. Richard focused on income growth. I focused on asset management. It worked. Until it didn't. There was a new credit card. Not hidden exactly. Just unexplained. The billing address was our home. But the spending patterns didn't match ours. Boutique hotel in the city, $640. Jewelry store, $2,300. Private dining, $480. None of it showed up at home. No new jewelry in my box. No hotel conference on the calendar. No client dinners I'd heard about. Here's a surprising fact. Financial infidelity often precedes emotional exposure. People protect the money before they protect the lie. That's when I stopped feeling confused and started feeling alert. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I called Margaret Holloway, 56 years old, family law attorney, precise, methodical, a woman who had seen every version of betrayal you can imagine. We met at her office downtown on a Wednesday afternoon. I told Richard the first had a dentist appointment. Margaret listened without interrupting. No dramatic reactions. No pity. When I finished, she asked one question. Do you want proof? Or do you want protection? That question changed everything. Protection, I said. And so we began. Over the next 6 weeks, I gathered documents quietly. Tax returns, property deeds, business filings, retirement accounts, investment portfolios. Margaret ordered a preliminary forensic review. And that's when we discovered something bigger than an affair. Richard had created a secondary LLC 6 months earlier, registered under a variation of his middle name. Funds had been transferred into it gradually. $40,000, $75,000, $120,000. By the time we added it up, nearly $480,000 had been shifted. Not spent. Moved. Do you know what that means? He wasn't just planning to leave. He was planning to leave me with less. That's not emotion. That's strategy. Margaret leaned back in her chair and said calmly, "He believes you won't notice until it's too late." The sentence didn't break me. It clarified me. We documented everything. Dates, transfers, correspondence, even internal company policies. Because here's something Richard didn't think about. Executive relationships with direct report assistants violate corporate ethics agreements, especially undisclosed ones. And Sophie had signed that agreement too. But I wasn't ready to use that. Not yet. At home, I played my role perfectly. Cooked dinner. Asked about his day. Helped Daniel with algebra. Toured colleges with Mia. And I watched him grow bolder. Distance turns into arrogance when someone thinks they've won. Then, 3 weeks before our anniversary, Richard came home unusually cheerful. "We should make the party big," he said. 20 years deserves something memorable. Memorable. The word lingered. He insisted on inviting colleagues, board members, people who had no personal connection to our marriage. That's when I understood. He wasn't planning a celebration. He was planning a reveal. A public reset. A narrative where he looked brave, honest. A man choosing happiness. What he didn't know is that I had already filed preliminary paperwork. What he didn't know was that every transfer had been documented. What he didn't know was that the envelope had already been assembled. On the morning of our anniversary, he kissed my forehead and said, "Tonight is going to change everything." I looked at him, and for the first time in months, I agreed. "Yes," I said softly. "It is." But what he didn't realize was that I wasn't the one about to lose control. And when that envelope opened, control would shift in a way he never saw coming. Public humiliation is loud. Legal destruction is quiet. When Richard slid his finger under the seal of that envelope, he thought he was still directing the night. After all, he had just detonated a marriage in front of 60 witnesses. What more power could there be? But power isn't about volume. It's about leverage. The first document he pulled out was clean, formal, headed with a law firm's letterhead. Margaret Holloway and Associates. I watched his eyes scan the first paragraph. His forehead tightened. "What is this?" he muttered under his breath. "Keep reading," I said. The room was silent, but not the casual kind. This was the suffocating silence of people realizing they're watching something irreversible unfold. He turned the page. This one was worse. A summary of a forensic financial review conducted over the previous 8 weeks. Line items, dates, transfer amounts, destination accounts. $480,000 moved into a secondary LLC registered under Richard Andrew Carter. Registered 6 months ago. Without my knowledge. Without disclosure. Did he forget I signed joint tax returns? Did he think large transfers don't leave digital trails? His breathing changed. Shorter. Sharper. He flipped to the third page. That's when the color drained from his face. Because the third page wasn't about money. It was about corporate policy. A copy of the company's executive conduct agreement. Highlighted sections. Clauses regarding undisclosed relationships with subordinates. Mandatory reporting requirements. Attached to it? A drafted ethics complaint. Not filed. Yet. And there, in black and white, were 2 names. Richard Carter. Sophie Lane. Across the room, Sophie shifted in her chair. She hadn't seen inside the envelope yet, but she could see Richard unraveling. "What did you do?" he whispered, his voice cracking just enough for me to hear. I held his gaze. I started over. His jaw tightened. "You can't do this." It was almost amusing. Minutes ago, he had declared he was starting a new life. Bold. Liberated. Honest. Now he was discovering that new beginnings can cut both ways. Margaret stepped forward from the back of the room. She had been seated quietly at a side table, introduced earlier as an old friend from graduate school. She wasn't smiling. Yes, she said calmly, she can. That's when the whispers began. Guests shifting uncomfortably. One of the board members straightened in his chair. Phones subtly lifted. Not to record, but to text. Damage control travels fast in corporate circles. Richard flipped to the fourth document. A divorce filing. Timestamped 8:12 a.m. that morning. Filed before the party even began. His lips parted slightly. You filed? He asked, louder now. Yes. You blindsided me. There it was. The irony hung in the air so thick it almost felt visible. I blindsided you? I repeated evenly. You could see the realization spreading across his face. This wasn't an emotional reaction. This wasn't desperation. This was orchestration. The next attachment detailed asset tracing findings. It stated clearly that failure to return transferred marital funds within 72 hours would result in formal fraud proceedings. Fraud. Not just divorce. Fraud. He looked up at me then, not angry, not superior. Afraid. Do you know the difference between someone who's caught cheating and someone who's caught planning financial betrayal? The second one knows they can lose everything. Sophie finally stood up. Richard, what is this? He didn't answer her. Because he didn't have one. Margaret addressed the room calmly. To clarify, this is a private matter. However, given tonight's public announcement, it seems appropriate that transparency follows. Transparency. The word hit harder than any accusation. One of the board members, Thomas Green, 52, cleared his throat. Richard, is there something we should know? The same colleagues he had invited to witness his new beginning were now watching his credibility fracture. Richard ran a hand through his hair. This is being blown out of proportion. Is it? Was transferring nearly $500,000 proportionate? Was publicly announcing an affair at an anniversary party proportionate? Sophie's voice trembled slightly. You told me everything was handled. That sentence shifted the energy again. Everything was handled. Meaning she knew. Maybe not about the LLC, but about the exit. The plan. And here's the twist Richard never anticipated. Sophie had also signed the executive conduct agreement. Violation could mean immediate termination. Loss of stock options. Loss of severance. Her confidence flickered. Margaret added gently, the company's compliance officer has been informed that documentation may be forthcoming. Maybe. Not is. The choice was still his. Return the money quietly. Or escalate publicly. That's when Richard did something unexpected. He raised his voice. You planned this. I tilted my head slightly. No, I said. You did. The room didn't gasp this time. It absorbed. Because the truth had weight. He thought he was orchestrating a grand reveal. A man choosing happiness over obligation. Instead, he had walked straight into evidence. And then, just when it seemed the night couldn't tilt any further, Mia stood up. Losing a marriage hurts. Losing control terrifies. When Mia stood up, the room shifted again. This wasn't legal language. This wasn't corporate policy. This was something far more dangerous. Truth from a child who had been watching quietly. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She just looked at her father and said, we already knew. You could hear someone inhale sharply across the room. Richard blinked. Knew what? Mia's voice stayed steady. That you were leaving. You stopped coming home months ago. Even when you were there. That sentence landed harder than the fraud notice. Because it wasn't about money. It was about absence. Daniel stood too. He wasn't as composed. His jaw was tight, fists clenched at his sides. You missed my playoff game, he said. You said it was work. But Mom was the only one in the stands. Richard opened his mouth to defend himself, but nothing came out. Here's something people don't talk about. Children notice emotional withdrawal long before adults admit it. They feel the temperature drop before anyone names the cold. The party that was meant to showcase Richard's bold new chapter had turned into a mirror. And he didn't like what it reflected. Sophie shifted again, uncertainty replacing whatever confidence she had walked in with. She looked younger suddenly. Smaller. Richard, she said quietly, you said this would be clean. Clean. There's that word again. He had framed this as liberation. A fresh start. A brave decision. But fresh starts aren't clean when they're built on concealment. Margaret stepped slightly forward, not aggressively, just enough to anchor the moment. For clarity, she said evenly, the divorce filing requests equitable distribution. Provided the transferred funds are returned within 72 hours, escalation beyond civil proceedings will not be necessary. Not necessary. The door was still open. Richard looked at me then, really looked at me, as if trying to locate the woman he thought he knew. You're destroying the family, he said, desperation edging into his tone. It was almost predictable. When accountability arrives, it often disguises itself as victimhood. I didn't raise my voice. You started over, I replied calmly. I protected what we built. That was the difference. He was chasing something new. I was preserving something real. One of the board members quietly excused himself to take a call. Another avoided eye contact entirely. Corporate reputations are fragile things. Scandals spread faster than apologies. Richard's breathing grew heavier. His hands, once so steady during quarterly earnings calls, were shaking. Do you want my job too? He snapped. There it was. Not, do you want to save this marriage? Not, can we fix this? His fear wasn't about us. It was about status. Control. Image. That's when Sophie's composure cracked completely. You told me she wouldn't fight, she said, her voice tight with anger now. You said she didn't pay attention to the finances. The irony was almost unbearable. He underestimated the one person who had balanced every ledger for 2 decades. Daniel looked at his father with something worse than anger. Disappointment. And if you've ever seen that expression in your child's face, you know it cuts deeper than shouting ever could. The compliance officer, discreetly invited under the pretense of being a family acquaintance, finally stepped forward. Calm. Neutral. Mr. Carter, she said, we'll need to review certain disclosures first thing Monday morning. Professional. Controlled. But unmistakable. The walls were closing in. Richard sank into his chair. Not dramatically. Just deflated. The confident man who had raised a glass 20 minutes earlier now looked like someone who had miscalculated badly. He rubbed his temples. What do you want? He asked finally. That question hung in the air. Not shouted. Not sarcastic. Genuine. What did I want? Revenge? Public ruin? To watch everything burn? I shook my head slightly. Peace, I said. And I meant it. Return the money. Sign the terms. Keep this civil. The choice was his. For a long moment, no one spoke. The gold banner behind us, 20 years strong, suddenly felt like a relic from a different timeline. Richard looked around the room at colleagues who wouldn't meet his eyes. At Sophie, who was already calculating her own exposure. At his children, who stood firmly beside me. And in that instant, I think he realized something far more devastating than financial loss. He hadn't just misjudged me. He had misjudged everyone. But what none of us knew yet was how quickly the fallout would spread once the doors of that private dining room opened. Because the real consequences? They hadn't even begun. Have you ever noticed how the loudest moments aren't always the ones that change your life? Sometimes the real turning point happens later. Quietly. In a courthouse hallway. In a bank office. In the way your home sounds different when one voice disappears from it. That anniversary party was loud. The aftermath was surgical. 3 months after Richard raised that glass and announced he was starting over, I was sitting in a beige conference room signing the final settlement documents. Fluorescent lights. Cheap coffee. A stack of papers so thick it looked like it could hold a door open. Richard sat across from me. Not in a suit this time. No polished executive smile. Just a rumpled button-down and the exhausted expression of someone who'd been waking up at 3 a.m. for weeks. Because here's what happened after that party. First, the money came back. Not because Richard suddenly found his conscience, but because he didn't have a choice. Margaret had given him 72 hours, and the evidence trail was airtight. Transfers reversed. Accounts disclosed. The LLC quietly dissolved. He tried to negotiate at first. Let's keep this private, he said in a late-night call 2 days after the party. His voice was softer than I'd heard in months. We can do this without destroying everything. Destroying everything. I almost laughed. He had stood in front of 60 people, my children included, and shattered our marriage with a toast. And now he wanted privacy. I didn't raise my voice. Return the funds, I said. Then we talk. And he did. On Monday morning, Margaret confirmed the deposits. Every cent traced and returned to marital accounts. The legal thread of fraud proceedings stayed in the folder where it belonged. But the corporate side? That moved on its own timetable. Because rumors don't wait for court orders. 2 of Richard's colleagues had been texting before dessert was served. The board members he invited had gone quiet immediately afterward, but quiet doesn't mean loyal. It means cautious. By the end of the week, Richard was placed on leave pending review. That's the corporate phrase for, we can't be seen standing next to you right now. He called me furious the day he got the notice. You went after my career. I didn't even need to argue. You announced your affair at a company-attended event, I said. You invited them. You made it their problem. Silence. Then a bitter laugh. He knew. The worst part for him wasn't even losing the role. It was losing the narrative. He wanted to be the hero of his own story. The man brave enough to walk away. The one who followed his heart. Instead, he became the man who tried to hide $500,000 and got exposed in front of his board. And Sophie? Sophie resigned before HR could officially terminate her. It was a calculated move. People do that sometimes when they think it looks better on paper. It didn't. Her resignation didn't erase the policy violation or the optics. And it definitely didn't erase the fact that she had sat at my table that night like she belonged there. I heard, through someone who knew someone, that she moved cities within a month. Maybe for a fresh start. Maybe because the old one had a stain on it. Meanwhile, the quieter consequences unfolded at home. Mia didn't speak to her father for weeks. Not because I told her not to. I never did that. I refused to be the middleman in Richard's relationship with the kids. If he wanted to repair what he broke, he would have to do it himself. But teenagers don't forget humiliation. They don't forget being forced to sit in a room while their parent turns their family into a spectacle. Daniel acted like he didn't care. That was his defense. He shrugged. He stayed in his room. He laughed too loudly at videos that weren't even funny. Until one night, 2 weeks after the party, I found him in the kitchen at midnight staring into the fridge like it contained answers. Hey, I said gently. You okay? He swallowed and said, is this my fault? Like, if I was better, would he stay? That question is the part nobody posts about. Nobody turns into a dramatic clip. But it's the part that matters. I pulled him into a hug and said no. Adults make adult choices. Your job is to be 14. He nodded, but I could tell he didn't fully believe it yet. So I did what I could do. I gave them stability. Not a perfect story. Not a revenge fantasy. Stability. We started therapy. The 3 of us. A calm, practical counselor who didn't take sides, but didn't excuse reality either. Mia began writing again. Daniel rejoined his friend group. Slowly, the air in the house stopped feeling like it was waiting for a fight. And me? I didn't collapse. I didn't turn into someone bitter and sharp. I got busy. Remember how I said earlier that I'm good at math? After everything, I finished the finance certification I'd put off for years. Not because I needed to prove anything, but because I wanted something that was mine. A future that didn't depend on Richard's choices. I started consulting part-time, helping small business owners with budgeting and compliance. It grew faster than I expected. And in the process, I met women who whispered questions they were afraid to ask out loud. Should I check the statements? Is it normal for him to have separate accounts? What's an LLC, and why is his name on one I've never heard of? I never gave them paranoia. I gave them clarity. Because here's the reflection I keep coming back to. Richard didn't just betray me with an affair. He betrayed me with an assumption. He assumed I wouldn't notice. He assumed I wouldn't understand. He assumed I wouldn't act. That assumption was the real insult. Now, do you remember the opening question? What would you do if your husband stood up and left you in public? I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I didn't bargain. I planned. And yes, there's a part of me that grieved. 20 years doesn't disappear without leaving a bruise. I grieved the version of him I thought I had. The life I assumed we were building. The future I pictured without ever questioning it. But grief is not the same as regret. 3 months after the settlement, Richard asked to meet at a coffee shop to discuss co-parenting logistics. He sat across from me, hands wrapped around a paper cup he didn't drink. He looked older. Not by years. By consequences. He finally said, "Did you ever love me?" I paused. Not to punish him. To answer honestly. "For 20 years," I said. He nodded slowly, like that was both comfort and devastation. Then he asked, quietly, "Do you hate me?" I shook my head. "No. I just don't live my life around you anymore." That was the moment I knew I had started over too. Not with a toast. Not with a spectacle. But with a decision. So here's my question to you. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who thought you were too soft to fight back? If you have, comment prepared. Just that word. And if you know someone who's quietly ignoring the signs because they don't want to believe what they're seeing, share this story with them. Not to scare them. To remind them that calm is powerful and preparation is protection. Subscribe if you want more real-life stories where the ending isn't what anyone expects. Because Richard wanted to start over. So I did. Just not the way he planned. It ended when Richard made one last desperate move that he thought would bring him back on top, and instead, it exposed him for good.